As you know, throughout this week, if you've been watching, we've been having conversations here on the AM Report about the impact of rolling blackouts on the country. So today, we're in conversation with a health journalist who will be giving us some insights on some of the information that they get from health workers. Now, according to health professionals, load shedding can literally determine whether a patient lives or dies. Let's unpack this further. We're joined by Copelyn, who is a health journalist with Bhekisisa. Jessie, it's great to have you with us on the program. It's the kind of insight we need. You know, we always talk about the very real impact on life or death scenarios of load shedding. And I've just been reading through the article that you wrote about just one bout of load shedding at Charlotte Maxeke Academic Hospital. I want to let you tell the story of what you were told by this doctor.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So the source was a medical student. He was a final year medical student, and he was working at Charlotte Maxeke as part of his final year rotations. While working there, this was in late July, in the emergency unit of the hospital. So he was seeing patients who were, in desperate need of quick attention and immediate attention. While working there, a patient was brought in who was a young man in his early 20s, and he was unconscious. He had apparently fallen from a very significant height, and he was unconscious. He'd hit his head, and he'd suffered quite a serious brain injury, and he needed immediate attention. They performed a series of kind of routine medical tests, one of which is that they shine a torchlight into the patient's eyes. If someone's already brain dead and can't be helped, then their eyes, their pupils won't constrict. This patient's pupils did constrict, and a series of other medical checks determined that there was a chance that he could still be saved. And so the next thing they needed to do was take him to a CT scanner. The CT scanner sort of is a sophisticated X-ray machine that would allow the doctors to get a 3D image of his brain, and that would allow them to determine, whether he could be operated on and how he could be operated on. When they went to make the booking for the CT scanner, this medical student and a series of other doctors who, were on his team, they were told that it wouldn't be possible because the hospital had been struck by load shedding. They weren't actually aware of that at the time because most of the hospital, or most of the emergency room at least, is supported by generators, so all the lights were still on. But the CT scanner had been left without power and would be left without power for the duration of load shedding. Yeah. The result is that this patient who was, needed to be acted on very quickly in order to have any chance was forced to wait for 2 to 3 hours until the electricity came back on. Once it did come back on and the CT scanner was back up and running again, they performed that torchlight test again. And they found that neither of his pupils responded anymore. Sure. And they later determined that evening that, he had brain, he was brain dead. According to this medical student's report, if there had been a window to save this person, it was essentially closed by that 2 or 3 hour wait. I
actually want to just read a few lines from the article that you wrote just about this sort of movement of time from the first time those initial tests were conducted on the patient with that torchlight being shone over his eyes. And then you go on and write about an hour later, this doctor's supervisor repeated the torchlight test. This time the patient's right pupil responded, but the left eye just stared back, blank and fixed. And, of course, the doctor telling you that he really wanted to help. They all did. They really wanted to help this patient, but there was nothing they could do, and it was just heartbreaking. By the time the power came back on, 3 hours after the patient had been booked into hospital, neither of the man's pupils moved. But there was still a small chance that the hospital's brain surgeons could save him, so they pushed him into the scanner once the electricity came back on. The machine revealing a brain bleed so severe that the neurosurgery department decided that if there had been a window to save him, as you say, Jessie, it had now passed. I mean, the most heartbreaking part about the story, and there are many, many heartbreaking parts, but it's just one incident in one episode of load shedding.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, even if you think about that particular case, I guess, where the CT scanner wasn't working, it's likely that there were also other people who were waiting for the use of that CT scanner, and apparently this is also a common problem when it comes to MRI machines as well. And so, any particular instance where a piece of like crucial medical technology goes offline, you're going to create a backlog. Adam Mohammed's been speaking to the news frequently about these issues lately, and how sort of negatively this affects patient healthcare, from pieces of medical equipment not working to water not being steadily supplied to the hospital due to load shedding, to sections of the hospital even experiencing blackouts because obviously only portions of the hospital are supported by generators.
Yeah, and as I understand it, according to what you've written in this article, CT scanners is one of those pieces of specialized medical equipment that actually uses a lot of power. So a generator is just not enough when there is load shedding to power up a CT scanner. I mean, by its nature, if you're being rushed to hospital and you're in the emergency room, time is what's of the essence, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I understand it, the idea is in many hospitals what they'll do is they'll have separate generators for the CT scanners and MRIs because they use so much power. But yeah, there can be faults, and I mean, apparently the CT scanner was connected to a generator, but it still didn't end up supporting it, and there are apparently a couple of different reasons for that. But essentially, the generators and the UPSs that the hospital use apparently aren't sort of foolproof. Apparently, for instance, even if you have a working generator for a CT scanner, the shift in power from drawing power from the grid to drawing power from the UPS, that shift is apparently, sometimes the CT scanners don't respond well to that shift.
I mean, bottom line is the specialized equipment, sorry Jesse, and just normal appliances, they don't respond well to constantly being switched on and off. Yeah,
that's absolutely right. And especially for something like, I mean, this was an emergency, so it is literally, it is the place that you're supposed to go in order to get immediate attention because your situation is so severe. And it's very clear from the story that load shedding is basically sort of crippling those units when it occurs.
Heartbreaking for this young patient who you said was in his 20s, heartbreaking for their family as well, knowing that had there not been load shedding at the time of his accident, that his life could have been saved. I mean, the question that I've been asking Adam Mohammed, speaking to him this week and a number of times over the past couple of months is, can we put a figure to the lives lost as a direct result of load shedding?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly wouldn't be able, I'm not in a position to provide that figure, since, this was just one story. But, I mean, yeah, it's sort of worth kind of mentioning that this, the response to that incident was, of course, not like any great surprise. It's not like doctors sort of rushed to report on this issue. It was, everyone was very devastated, according to this medical student who spoke to me. Like, they were all very upset, but it wasn't viewed as kind of like an incredibly surprising case. They all just kind of continued with their day. And so, this was brought up to me sort of fairly casually, actually. I mean, someone sort of told me about this at a dinner. So it wasn't like they, came to me as a reporter and were like, oh my God, this is a terrible thing. This is a really surprising thing that's happened. It's a really newsworthy event. So I think, that sort of indicates that this is probably something that's happening fairly frequently, to be honest.
Adam Mohammed as well, calling repeatedly for hospitals to be taken off the load shedding schedule, to be exempt from load shedding, and for obvious reasons. Jesse Copelyn, let me thank you for your time this morning. He's a health journalist with Bhekisisa. Incredibly worrying story, this.